Welcome back, or welcome if you're just joining us. It's the France 24 debate, and we're looking at the election of Donald Trump seen through the eyes of France's president, François Hollande, who's given his first sit-down interview to France 24 and to our partners from Radio France International and TV5. We're doing it in the company of Vivian Walt, correspondent for Time Magazine, Gil Mihaly, editorial director of Causeur, also columnist for Yediot Aeronot, the Israeli daily newspaper, Bruno Cotres, political analyst at Sevipov, which is the political, how would you describe it?
It's the Center
polling
for,
institute? Or
yes, it's the Center for Political Research in Sciences Po.
At Sciences Po, the French Political Science Institute. And joining us from Marrakech, John Sturman, who teaches system dynamics at MIT and is attending that climate change summit, COP22 as it's known. Welcome back to the show. We were talking just before the break about what President Trump will do when it comes to Eastern Europe, when it comes to Ukraine, and more broadly, when it comes to NATO. Now, it seems as though the outgoing president of the United States has had to play a reassurer-in-chief. Barack Obama, in his first press conference since last Tuesday's election, tempering panic in some quarters over a Trump presidency, saying he's not an ideologue but a deal maker. Here's what he had to say about NATO.
In my conversation with the president-elect, he expressed a great interest in maintaining our core strategic relationships. And so one of the messages I will be able to deliver is his commitment to NATO and the transatlantic alliance. I think that's one of the most important functions I can serve at this stage during this trip, is to let them know that there is no weakening of resolve when it comes to America's commitment to maintaining a strong and robust NATO relationship, and a recognition that those alliances aren't just good for Europe, they're good for the United States, and they're vital for the world.
Vivian Walt, there's no weakening of the alliance.
I just don't quite understand what Obama is basing that on. I think all bets are off from January 20th when Trump is in the Oval Office, and it depends on who's going to be Secretary of Defense and who's going to be Secretary of State, and we don't know that yet. I do think that Trump touched on something that is a very broad feeling in the US, and that is that people are kind of fed up with having to take on what they see as a disproportionate burden globally in terms of military. And in that respect, he actually has a point. The EU, very few EU NATO members pay their fair share of what they're supposed to under the NATO mandate supposed to pay. They've been cutting personnel for years on end, and there is a point to be made here about that. I think
And on that point, Bruno Cotres, our colleague from RFI, put it to François Hollande saying, France has upped its military budget the last few years, but it's still below that 2% of GDP that's supposed to be the norm for all NATO members.
Yes, and François Hollande just said that, yes, that's true, but at the same time that we are among the EU countries having the biggest military defense budgets. And so François Hollande has said many things on this question. Finally, during the interview, he has talked quite a lot about the alliance and I would say the relationship between the US and France in fighting against terrorism. When François Hollande said, on the climate change, we do not disagree. We disagree, but on the defense, security, fighting against terrorism, we are strong allies. And François Hollande made it very clear that he would like the budget of defense for France to go up. And also that between the lines, he was obviously talking about what Sarkozy did during the mandate of Sarkozy. And it was absolutely obvious at the end of the mandate that François Hollande was positioning himself as the head of the army, the head of the military force. And we are back to François Hollande, the head of the French state, which is fighting against terrorism.
And this is the difference with the United States. And Gil was talking about the Americans being war-weary. François Hollande, who like we were saying just before the break, wants to probably run for re-election next spring, bragging about France's role on the world stage with bombing raids in Syria and Iraq, with the intervention against jihadists in Mali.
Yes, François Hollande has clearly, since quasi the beginnings of François Hollande mandate, François Hollande has tried to interpret and to explain to the French that he is the president which is going to fight against terrorism more actively even than Sarkozy did. And it is extremely interesting because the natural tendency of the left would have been normally only to fight on domestic issues, economic and socio-economic issues. When François Hollande has been seeing such difficulties in France to explain that he was the left president delivering left policies, on the contrary, he has tried to interpret its presidency role as fighting against terrorism. So it would not be surprising to see François Hollande to play that card in the coming weeks.
Again, he talked up France and Germany being at the pillars of a common European defense, which up to now we haven't really seen.
Yes, and we're taking for granted that it's an American interest that Europeans invest more in defense. I'm not sure it is. I mean, the Americans would have been happy if France, like Great Britain, wouldn't have had the autonomous nuclear possibility, that they would give missiles to France and keep the keys. I'm not sure that the Americans are very happy that when they try to sell F-18s or F-35s, they find Rafale in the other side. So the question of how strong the Europeans should be is not that obvious. Well, he decided that they should chip in more. It is right because he's going to define what is the American interest. But there's a debate around it.
All right, John Sturman, again, we're in the dark as to what President Trump will do. After all, we've heard him complain about the U.S. Having to pick up the slack for its NATO allies, but at the same time saying that he would be tough in fighting ISIS. When you take a look at those advising him on foreign policy, do you have any idea which way this is going?
So I don't think anybody can claim to know which way it's going to go. We don't know who the people are who will take the key posts in the defense and national security establishments and at the State Department. There are rumors, but nobody knows yet. I think what we can say is that as he gets briefed on the security situation, briefings that have already started, I believe he's going to be confronted with the reality that the world is far more interconnected and far less simple than the way candidates portray it on the campaign trail. And what I am hopeful for, and again, this is not a prediction, but what I am hopeful for is that his advisors will begin to demonstrate to him that one of the best ways to improve the national security of the United States and the rest of the world, but the United States, is to help limit the damage from climate change. He received a briefing document on this, his transition team received a briefing document on the national security implications of climate change just in the last 24 hours or so. We don't know whether he will be briefed on it personally or whether he will act on it, but it has been clear for many years that one of the best ways to improve the security of the citizens of the United States and of Europe and of everyone in the world is to limit the damage from climate change. The refugee crisis of the last year that has caused so much angst in Europe contributed to the Brexit exit and contributed to his victory in the United States. One can make a good case that this was made far worse by climate change, and unless we act on that, that's just the beginning. So I believe that serious analysis that he will be exposed to will show that this is an opportunity for the United States to make a big difference on our security, but without necessarily having to dramatically boost our hard weaponry expenditure.
Vivian Walt.
I sincerely hope that John is right, that he will basically come to the realization that he needs to do this. I think it's very interesting in the US at the moment. You have a whole generation of new voters who basically have known nothing but war. They don't have any conscious memory of the 9/11 attacks in 2001. They were little babies at the time, and they are now voters. And you also have the passing of the World War II generation, of an entire generation for whom, like, the alliance with Europe was absolutely core to the survival of the planet, if you like. And that, I think, for a lot of people, that kind of logic is fading. And I think it's very challenging, actually, for leaders in the US and Europe.
In the interview that we heard on France 24 earlier, Bruno Cotres, the French president, was asked, obviously, about the rise of the far-right National Front. They're due to get another boost, I suppose, from the election of Donald Trump. It certainly sounds like it at this point in the polls.
That's true that since the election of Trump, we've got many comments in France. Does it mean that Marine Le Pen could win the next presidential election? What exactly does it mean? Could it be that we have also secret voting in the polls for Marine Le Pen? And François Hollande, at the end of the interview, gave quite an interesting set of interesting sentences by saying that obviously we can understand the populists, that we are living in a complex world, plenty of threats everywhere, plenty of fears everywhere. But
and he pointed to Brexit, he pointed to...
Yes, and he explicitly called for cohesion, national cohesion, but also did exactly the same at the international level, which is that we should, EU and France, we should communicate with the new US president, and we need to find cohesion. And it said exactly the same for France. And all of that indicates clearly the new lines of
All right, Bruno,
candidates.
it's not scientific, the question I'm asking you, but when you went to bed Tuesday night, what did you think the chances of a Le Pen president would be? And when you woke up Wednesday morning, what did you think the chances of
I still don't think that Marine Le Pen could win the next presidential election, but I know that if the situation, the economic and the political situation of France still is the same over the next 5 years, that still we have unemployment at a high level, that still many French voters believe that their political class is incompetent, incapable to solve the major problems. Yes, the next time in about 5 years, Marine Le Pen, why not? She could obviously capitalize on the lack of success of the next French president, because we've got Sarkozy, then François Hollande, and many right-wing voters would say, finally, why not Marine Le Pen? Why do we block the road to Marine Le Pen?
Well, do you share Bruno Cotres' opinion that it won't be the far-right National Front this time around?
I have no idea. For me, it's an option. But I do agree with everything else he said, because the problem is not that the world is complicated. The problem is that for too many people, the leadership has a very bad performance. They are in trouble for a very long time. They feel that the situation is declining, that their kids will not have a better life. They might have as good as life as they had, and maybe their life will be worse. And for at least 25 years, if not 40 years, this problem is not addressed correctly. So people are, just like in the United States, they are fed up by the current system, and they look around, and for the moment, they didn't leave the game of the liberal democracy, because even Marine Le Pen in France is within the game of the liberal. There are no militias. She's not talking about changing the regime. I don't know what she's going to do, but many of the most fearful signs of the 30s are absolutely lacking here. So we are still in the liberal democratic system, but we are on the margin.
Vivian Walt, when it comes to...
Well, I mean, Marine Le Pen's, I believe, the centerpiece of what she has campaigned on is getting France out of the EU. And, more than Trump, she has the UK to look to as a success story and as a way of her boosting her own chances. Two major things have happened in the last few months that nobody thought would happen. And I think, other than the fact that you have a 2-round system of elections in France, I don't see what would limit her chances to become president.
When he talked about the United States, François Hollande said this isn't just any country where it's happening. But he also said, John Sturman, that in your country, they're very strong institutions and that you can't get around things like the Congress and the courts.
Well, I think we have to take very seriously a candidate who fed fears of immigrants, who explicitly profited from fanning the flames of xenophobia. We have to take that very seriously. I agree the United States is not Weimar Germany, but the people in Weimar Germany didn't think they were electing a party that would do what we all know it did, to the everlasting shame of all democratic peoples. This is not something we can assume is not a risk. And I think people have to organize, people have to express their solidarity with the disadvantaged, with the poor, everywhere, not just the United States. Having said that, you know, the Republican Party now controls not only the presidency, but both houses of Congress, and will therefore have an opportunity to shape the federal judiciary. They also control most of the governorships and state legislatures. If you look at the electoral map, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote, and it's not really red and blue, it's largely shades of purple, but there are still serious risks that this system is out of balance, and we need to be vigilant against the enactment of laws that prey on people's fears and will put not only liberal democracy, but the world system at risk.
Bruno Cotres, isn't this amazing? Gilma Haley brought it up. Liberal democracy is not at risk yet. Did you think we'd be having this kind of conversation in 2016?
No, certainly not. But we've got before clear sign that something is going on. And in particular, in the French case, we do at Sciences Po, we do an annual survey, which is a barometer on political trust in France, where we are asking many questions to the French about their trust in institutions, their satisfaction with democracy. And we've got a very strange result 2-3 years ago, that nearly half of the French are saying that what a good system for France, what a good political system for France could be a strong leader who doesn't care about elections and parliament. We've got that 3-4 years ago. We were amazed by the results, so we decided to repeat the question a second time, a third time, a fourth time, and still we've got about half of the French saying that it could be a good system, so which is absolutely obvious that French are at the same time still in the liberal democracy framework, that still we believe in electoral institutions.
How strong? How strong?
But still, we are a majority of French believing that electoral democracy and liberal democracy is the best system, obviously, but at the same time, the level of dissatisfaction, distrust with democracy is absolutely at an amazing level already in France. And obviously, Marine Le Pen's success is a clear sign that something goes wrong in the way that the French express attitude and satisfaction with the state of the system or democracy.
By the way, the French system, the French electoral campaign kicks into high gear this coming Sunday with the first round of the center-right U.S.-style open primaries. The frontrunner had been a former prime minister and foreign minister, Alain Juppé, a centrist who, with views that are similar to his former boss, Jacques Chirac, in a lot of respects, you might say. He was well ahead in the polls. With what's happened in the United States, could we see a surprise come next Sunday?
Why not? Why not? I think that every scenario is absolutely possible. What we know is that it is extremely likely that number 1, 2, and 3, we don't know exactly in which order, but 1, 2, and 3 will be Alain Juppé, Nicolas Sarkozy, and certainly François Fillon.
The former prime minister.
The former prime minister. So if we have a surprise, the big surprise could be that finally Sarkozy is leading the first round. And if Sarkozy leads the first round, it will depend on how much the lead is. Is it a big lead? Where is exactly Alain Juppé? And if Sarkozy would finally lead the first round with quite a significant margin, so then everything is possible. Still on today, what the polls are saying is that Alain Juppé would certainly be qualified for the second round. and Nicolas Sarkozy also. We don't know which will be the one and who will be the two, and this is going to have an effect on the final result, obviously.
And if Nicolas Sarkozy, who lost the job in 2012, unpopular man, gets to the second round, we have an unpopular outgoing president, an unpopular former president, and Marine Le Pen. What happens in the presidential election?
In the presidential election, if Alain Juppé would be finally the winner of the primary, Alain Juppé would certainly win the presidential election, more likely that Nicolas Sarkozy would, because if Nicolas Sarkozy is opposed to Marine Le Pen on the second round, the left will not come to vote for Sarkozy. It is extremely certain. So if the left doesn't come to vote against Marine Le Pen, automatically, because the Front National voters are extremely loyal, they're extremely mobilized already, it could jump Marine Le Pen to 40, 45, why not, in the second round.
All right, we're going to have to leave it there. I want to thank you, Bruno Cotres. I want to thank Vivian Walt, Gil Mahili, John Sturman for joining us from Marrakech at that Climate Change Summit. Stay with us. Our Media Watch segment is next. And we say hello to James Creedon. James, we heard John Sturman saying he's hoping that advisors will manage to sway Donald Trump before he makes any rash decisions when it comes to climate change.
That's right. You can hear a lot of those voices coming out across various media, whether it be heads of state, whether it be within internal voices within the US that are hoping to put pressure on Donald Trump. Let's take a look at some of those voices. François Hollande, we just heard from him, of course, this evening. He published this on Twitter before his interview to France 24 and RFI. The Paris Agreement is irreversible in law. And inaction would be disastrous for the world. And that word irreversible, he repeated it on air when speaking to France 24 a little bit earlier. French President, as picked up here by the Associated Press, French President François Hollande calls the Paris deal irreversible. So really there's a sense here, or certainly a strong bid from world leaders to point out that this is already en route. It's unstoppable. That was actually the word chosen by Ban Ki-moon. What other voices are we seeing? US officials themselves, obviously still representing the Obama administration, but they also in Marrakech have been saying that climate change efforts will continue despite Donald Trump's views. You have Bernie Sanders, of course, a lot of the political left in the US now looking to Bernie Sanders as perhaps a leader to replace, to fill in the vacuum after Hillary Clinton's loss. We have a president-elect who doesn't believe in climate change. Mr. Trump, you are dead wrong, he said, and millions of people are going to have to say that. And of course, we're seeing that those voices are increasingly raising themselves. Climate change is not a hoax. This is also Bernie Sanders. It's a threat to the entire planet. Just a quick whip through some of the other voices, François, because there are so many. This is an opinion piece in the Washington Post. So the, I suppose, left-leaning press in the US driving that message home as well, that denial of climate change would be catastrophic. You have voices such as Noam Chomsky, perhaps no surprise that Noam Chomsky, very much a left-wing activist, would be criticising Donald Trump, but he said the 8th of November was a significant date. Why was the 8th of November a significant date? Not because necessarily of the election, but there was actually a report delivered to the COP22 in Marrakech on the 8th of November by the World Meteorological Organization. It said for the past 5 years, past 5 years have been the hottest on record, and we're facing rising sea levels, of course, contributed to largely by the melting of huge and Antarctic glaciers. So he said this is huge news. It was underreported. It was probably more important than the US election, and we have to remember, and we have to keep our eye on that. Governor Jerry Brown as well of California was another voice of opposition. So those voices are certainly raising the issue.
All right, and when we see north of the border, they're talking about carbon capping and taxing. We didn't talk about him too much because we don't know how much power he's going to wield. Right. Myron E. Bell, who's slated to be one of the bosses at the EPA and who describes himself as a climate change contrarian.
Yes, I mean, that's a very nice way of putting it, really, isn't it? Because I think he has even said such things in the past as climate change might actually be a good thing. He wrote an op-ed in 2006 called Love Global Warming, In it, he urged readers to think about the benefits of climate change, less severe weather storms, warmer weather, which means more beach time. That might actually not necessarily be in line with what the report that was delivered in Marrakech on the 8th of November. So he's certainly quite a radical figure. Just as one example, Francois, last year at the Paris Climate Summit, he was named as one of 7 climate criminals by NGOs that were fighting climate denying lobbyists at the Paris Agreement. So one of those faces is actually his. And he was pointed out as one of 7 climate criminals. That's how he was being painted last year at the Paris Climate Summit, and he's going to be the head of the transition at the Environmental Protection Agency. So certainly there will be forces that don't agree with each other colliding over this issue.
All right, many thanks. A heated debate to follow on that. James Creedon, I want to thank you. I want to thank our panel once again. Thank you for joining us here in the France 24 debate.